Hi, my name is Margie Carver-Stuck, and we are here today to introduce you and show you all about life in an 1802 log house. There's lots going on, so keep your eyes open, and we'll take a walk first of all around the outside of the log house, and then we'll invite you in.
Hello, my name is Cheryl Ostrowski. I'm going to show you around our garden and our log house today. Gardening at the log cabin would have been done right here on the outside of our front door. If you take a look, you can see some of the plants that would be growing here. Right now we have quite a few herbs that are growing. This herb is sage. And sage would be considered a culinary herb. It would have been grown to use in the food that we prepare. We have lemon balm right next to it. And the lemon balm would be used for medicinal purposes and for culinary purposes. We could put it in our food to flavor it, and we would take lemon balm to try and crush up and use as a bandage on our skin if we happen to have a cut or an abrasion. Some of the other things that we would do with it is we would drink it, because at that time we were boycotting tea from England, so we would make all different kinds of teas, and lemon balm tea would be one of the teas that we would make. This herb is called lamb's ear, and lamb's ear was used whenever you'd get a cut or an abrasion. You'd take and put some of the lemon balm salve or chamomile salve on your skin, and then you would take and pluck one of these. Well, we might have to redo that. And we would take off this little leaf, and it's very soft. So this would be our Band-Aid. Since we don't have a drugstore to go and get a Band-Aid, we could just wrap this around our finger where the cut was, and then we could take and tie a string around it, and that would be our bandage. This is the garden, which hasn't really been planted yet because it's early May, and we're thinking about what we're going to put in. Right now we have some herbs which are a perennial. They're a perennial herb, which means that they come back year after year. Right now they're in flower, and we can eat these flowers along with taking the stems that are not woody and chopping them up and using them in our different culinary things that we make. So that would be a perennial. And when we say perennial, we mean that it's going to come back year after year. It will die back to the ground and then grow up from the roots in the spring. And as you can see, it's really doing well with all the flowers. The flowers are also edible. It's spring now here at the log house, and I went out to the garden to take a look to see what came up from last year, and here we have some spring onions. I planted these last year in the fall, hoping that they would overwinter and come up, and now I have these to eat. I also planted Swiss chard in the garden in the fall, and it's come up too. And these greens are very important to our diet. At that time, we were susceptible to a disease called scurvy, and we needed to get our vitamin C, and green leafy things are a good source. Something else that would be in our garden would be peas. And some people like to eat these tops, and they call them the pea shoots. And they would put that in their salad. And along with that, you would find chive blossoms because they're edible. This is feverfew, and it's important because when you had a fever, this is what you would use. We would dry this, and then you could make a tea out of it, or you could actually chew it if it was fresh, if you wanted to get your fever down. We also have different herbs for different reasons. Some of these herbs, like this one, chamomile, would be another one that we would use for tea. And we would also use this herb, which is a mint, for tea. And we could also use mint and parsley, which is a culinary herb, to chew if we wanted to make our breath smell great. Another one that we use use, and this is the herb that most people would say is the one to get rid of bad breath, and that's rosemary. You would take and chew that, and that was supposed to get rid of your bad breath. The thing about these herbs are, we can't say that one herb is a culinary herb and another herb is a medicinal herb, because we use them for both purposes. We even use one herb for dyeing clothing. And this is called yarrow. And yarrow was also a medicinal herb too. You could use this one to take care of toothaches. You chew that. So it had a lot of purposes. But that's what we find about the herbs. People didn't take baths very often then, so what you needed to do was smell good, and one of the ways to do that was to make a sachet, or people called it a bosom bag, and they would put the herbs, the dried herbs, inside the bag, and then they tuck it in their shirts. And it was mostly women that did that. Men weren't so concerned about that. But this is lavender, and it would be one of the herbs that we would put in there. And we also like to make our clothes smell good, so lavender would often be planted along the fences of the gardens, and then we could lay our clothes or our sheets, or, well, we really didn't use sheets, but our blankets and things to make them smell good when they dried after we washed them, because we don't have detergent, we just make soap. And in the soap, we would also put the lavender, and we would also put the lemon balm too, and that's another herb that's over here. So we showed you that as we came in, but that's what we do with most of our herbs. We're at the back door of our log house, and I want to go through and show you our air conditioning. You can see the front door and the back door are in line so that the air can flow straight through, and that's how we were able to cool off our log house. As we go around the side of the log house, we come out to the front again, and right along the front you see that we have some berry bushes. These are red currants, and right now they're not ripe, so they're green, and when they do ripen up, we'll make some jam out of them. At this time of year, we find that there's all kinds of things that are available to us, and we would be foraging for whatever we could find out in the woods too. There might be mushrooms, there might be different things like ramps, which are wild onions, so we would be looking for anything that we could use. We especially like dandelions, because dandelion greens are delicious to eat in a salad.
Hello, my name is Kathy Murphy, and I would like to welcome you to the kitchen of the log house. The kitchen was primarily the heart of the home. It may not look like your kitchen, so we're going to take a little tour and see what's different. The first thing I usually point out to students is my stove. It looks much different than your stove. My stove at home has 4 burners. Your stove may have 4 or 6 or 8, it depends. But let me show you how many burners I have on my stove. On this particular one, you can see there's about 6 or 7. Anything you can hang a pot off of would be considered a burner. And right now I have some cornmeal mush cooking in this pan. We'll talk about that in a bit. And our heat source is not electric or gas, it is fire. And quite often the children were charged with keeping enough wood on hand for the fire. Now, baking, if I wanted to make pies or bread or something, this is called a reflector oven. I would put my baked good in there, and I would sit it in close proximity to the fire until it was done. Now, another thing that I show my students is this, and I will ask them, what do you think this is? I've had a number of suggestions. The most interesting one was a taco holder, but it is truly a toaster. You would put your bread into there, and again, either hold it over the fire or put it in close proximity. So those are a couple different things. All right, and this little tool is to help keep the fire going. It would push oxygen into the fire. You would literally blow into it. And that would help keep the fire glowing. Now, let's think about food. Did we have Beaver Super, or did we have Giant Eagle, or Shop and Save? We did not. So where would I get food for my kitchen? Well, this area was very rich in, you heard many of the things when you talk about the herbs and the gardens. We grew potatoes, we grew corn, tomatoes, beans. There were a number of berries in this area. There were nuts, there were squash, just a number of things in this area. The Three Sisters is something that you have heard about with the gardening. And we would make a stew. Now, what kind of meat would we have since there's no supermarket? We had a lot of squirrels in this area, rabbits. You may think that sounds funny, but a lot of people like that. And deer. We have a lot of deer in this area. So we could make a hearty stew with these ingredients. And we had grapes in this area. And one of the things we really have that we should be proud of and excited about is the maple syrup trees. And we have a maple syrup festival every year at Brady's Run. We would use that. And corn. Corn was a staple in those times. What I have cooking over here is a small dish of corn mush. And it does have some maple syrup on top of it. And it would be a tasty treat in those days. So there's my fruits and my vegetables. Oh, where do I put these things? Where's my refrigerator? There is no refrigerator. So if we walk over here, there is a latch on the floor. If we lift that up, there is a root cellar. And anything that needs to be kept cold or preserved, we would keep in the root cellar. In the winter isn't so much of a problem, but in the summer it is. And butter. We would make our own butter. And this is a small butter churn. If we were lucky, we had a cow so that you could get milk and have cream. And sometimes they would make it in a churn where you just took the cream and beat it and beat it and beat it. Sometimes they would hang it in a bag that hung from the rafters, and anytime somebody would walk by, they'd go like this until the butter became firm and butter. And let's see. And this is a sample of something that we could use to scoop out soup, or somebody, if they had a hearty appetite, may be able to use it for a bowl or a container. They may do with everything that they had there. Now, where would I get my water? We've looked at our stove, we've looked at our refrigerator, our water. And Mrs. Ostrowski is going to help me with this. There are 2 buckets. We have a river that's probably a quarter-mile away. So quite often, again, this is a job for kids. Are we doing that right? Mm-hmm. And it's heavy enough without any water in it. But then once you add the buckets, and then you walk a quarter-mile, fill it up with water, and then come back, it's quite a chore. So you were able to grow some muscles during that time. We used the water not only for cooking, but also for doing dishes, which we would probably do in a tub, a tin tub. Some other things that you'll see around the kitchen, Mrs. Ostrowski talked about her herbs outside. We have a lot of the dried herbs in here for cooking. And I would keep my kitchen clean by using the straw broom. Another interesting tool that we would see is a sharpener. You wanted to make sure that you had sharp knives and tools for both for hunting and for preparing your food. So you just literally make that go around and put your blades against that to sharpen it. All right, another big source of food in this area would have been fish. We have huge rivers and creeks huge water source. Beaver itself had a huge spring that served the area at this time as well. So fish, when you're, just go down over the hill and you could bring home dinner.
Good morning. Here we are today back in our 1802 log house. I think it would be wonderful to live here. And in fact, I've threatened my family to come down here for Thanksgiving sometime and do it the right way, for sure. Now, back in the day of 1802 and a little after, women would wear hats. And most of them look like this. And the reason that they wore a hat was to keep their hair clean, to keep it out of their eyes, and also it was probably very stylish at that particular time. I'm not a real big lover of hats, but I did want you to see my authentic hat. Okay, now on the table I have a few things that I'd like for you to see. Corn husks. Corn was a big deal back in the day, and the garden around the 1802 log house would grow a lot of corn. That corn would then be ground similarly as to doing a knife or whatever, a blade to sharpen, but they would use a sandstone, which is what this is. And actually you'd put two sandstones together and you would take the kernels of corn, the stuff that we use whenever we're eating corn on the cob, you would dry it, put it in between those two sandstones, and you would grate until it became this. Let me show you. Well, they didn't have Ziploc bags back then, but that was the easiest way to bring this down. But look, it's not exactly like flour, and it has texture. It feels like sand, but it isn't. And this would be the cornmeal that would be used in baking with. Now, if you'll take a look here, this would be one very, very favorite dish. You can see the syrup inside, and you can see that it almost looks like a pudding. It tastes great. My dad used to love it when my mother would make cornmeal mush for breakfast. And instead of eating a pancake, he would eat cornmeal mush made just with water, syrup, butter, salt and pepper, and the cornmeal. Okay, I did want to mention that to you. Now, I'm going to walk over this way. And you're going to see, appropriate for that time, you're going to see snowshoes. And these snowshoes, kids would strap onto their feet. They look awkward, don't they? But they would slide their foot into that leather part in the front, and they would be able to walk on top of the snow. Now you're saying, how could you do that? Well, when we just use our feet to walk on snow, we sink down in the snow, because all of our body weight, and for me that might be substantial, all of the body weight would just pull you right down in. With this type of thing, your body weight is distributed or moved over a larger period or a larger place, and you can walk actually on that snow. You can see some old wagon wheels here in the back. Of course, wagons would have been a very important thing for hauling, moving, and so forth in constructing the log cabin. Back here in the corner is a thing that oxen would have used, and two oxen would use this together, their heads each in one of the loops, okay? And they would pull at the same time and be able to move the wagon or move whatever it would be that needed transporting. Okay, you would have storage cupboards much like this, filled with all the things that you needed to keep. Not food items, but other items. You'll see here, we have a rocking chair. Most people had to stay in the kitchen to keep the fire going. If the fire went out in your house, in your log house, you would have to walk for miles to get a little bit of a starter for fire to begin the fire all over again. And you wouldn't want necessarily to do that. So, a lot of time spent in this old rocker. They used animal fur to keep them warm, to keep themselves warm. You can see the back of that. And that really was pretty much the go at the time. I have more skins that I'll be showing you as we get to the other side of the cabin. You know, in this cabin, you might have 12 to 14 people living in this one room. And you know, you think your brother or sister gets on your last nerve sometime? I'll tell you what, I don't know what you would do if you had 14 people in here. You had grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles and cousins and your own brothers and sisters, mom and dads, so you lived all in this house. You can believe that most of their time, even in the winter, everybody just kind of went outside and they had to get used to being in that cold weather. Okay, coming around, you can see some of the old pots and cooking utensils that were used. One of my favorite things, and I'm going to come up just a little closer, was this. Now, it's perfectly balanced. And what you would do is you would take a nubbin of a candle, put the wax down in there when it was hot and melted. You'd put that candle down in there, and if you had to go to the bathroom at night, you had to go outside. I mean, you didn't have the convenience of being indoors. So you would carry this with you to the outhouse, and you might have a little shelf area that you could hang that on, and that would allow the outhouse still to be with some light as you traveled along. Okay? Now, there was a huge need for trivets. This is called a trivet. And you would set this in the fireplace area and put a pan on top of it, and that would help whatever you were cooking not to burn. And also, if you brought it to the table, whatever you were cooking, you would set that on a trivet. Now, something I want to point out to you while I'm over here. These things are really heavy. I think I can still pick this up. Take a look at this little bugger. I'll tell you what, men back probably in about the 1700s would use these for chopping. Now, if you look carefully at the logs that make up the log house, they're square. They're not circular like a tree would be circular. And we think that these logs that this house was built with came from Fort McIntosh. And the reason we think that is because the soldiers didn't have a whole lot to do when they weren't on duty, and they could sit and they could level all of the round logs off and make them square. All right, as you'll notice, these logs are all squared off, okay? They're not round like a tree that had been cut down. So they have to cut the tree down, then they have to use this axe, and they're heavy. These guys must have been really strong. And they would level off the roundness of the log. So if you were a pioneer back in 1802, you would want to live permanently in a log house. If you were still moving about and you hadn't found the spot where you wanted to live, you might live for one winter in a log cabin, okay? Because the logs would be rounded. Okay, and now you'll notice in between the logs, there is a substance made of mud and clay, because you could get clay from the earth, and probably a little straw or grass would be in there to make it kind of firm up or be a little more solid. And then, much like our cement today, they didn't have that then, they would put this chinking, what they called chinking, in between the logs, and that would really make it a lot more airtight. Now notice I'm saying a lot more. I'll bet you there were some breezes that could wrestle through this place in the winter, and you really needed to have your fire to keep yourself warm. Okay, let me come around this way. We have more cooking utensils, always hanging close to the fire. And we have spinning wheels. And the spinning wheels were used after the sheep were sheared. Yes, people would have had sheep back in the day. And you would card that using two combs, and get it all straightened out, all the sheep wool, and then you would begin to spin it into strands. And those strands then would be used to make their clothing, something like a sweater or a coat, something that they would be warm enough in. That would be wool. Wool is also very water resistant, and they could be out in weather and it really would not make them feel cold or damp or wet. All right, now if we move on around here, this, by the way, Mrs. Murphy talked about, Kathy, this was a gourd, and they would have grown that in the garden, okay? And they would use it as a scoop, or they would use it to serve soup. They probably had a lot of soup, a lot of stew, and it's pretty cool. So they would cut those, and they would dry them out, hollow them out, take all the seeds out. You know, a pumpkin is really a gourd, so to speak, okay? Now, over here, hanging on the wall, as the fathers or the older brothers would leave, they might want to go out on the porch and have a smoke. And so they would use this pipe, and they would grow tobacco, big leaves that almost look like lettuce, but then they would dry those, and they would put the tobacco in here, light it up, and they would sit out on the front porch and have a little smoke. Get that back in there. Also, another type of broom, or a type of broom that could have been used back in the day, was made out of corn. And you know, when corn goes to seed, this is what the tassels, the top of the corn might look like. They would dry that, and then this probably would be a little easier for the kids to use, as they would sweep, one of their major jobs. You can imagine 10 or 14 people in a house. It'd get plenty dirty during the course of the day. They could sweep, the kids would do that, and it would be real good. Now, the furnishings, there would be one table in the front of the room, and most everything was done there, the crafts, the cooking, the writing, the schooling that the kids would do. Probably most children's first teacher would have been their mother or their grandmother. And whenever they would cook, on the bottom of the pan, it would become sooty or loaded with carbon. And they would take their finger and get it dirty on the bottom of that pan, and then they would be able to write and learn their letters. Another thing, back in that time, as we go further into the 1800s, kids had slate boards, because slate could be found out in the ground, up on the hills or whatnot, and they can ship those out, and they could actually write on those chalkboards too. Now, you might wonder, well, what did kids do to have fun? There wasn't a whole bunch of time for fun, but they did play games, and there is a snippet that you will be able to see of some of the games that the kids did play. Take some time and watch that. Also, they did a lot of crafts, and once again, going back to the corn, these are corn husks dried, and they would take these and make them into dolls. And it's not real hard to do. This is the beginning of one of those dolls. You would have to have the corn husks wet, and then put them over a stick that you would pick up out in the yard, and bend it, use some twine to tie the waist, and put kind of like a shawl around the neck, and that can be the arms, and draw a face on this little bugger, and she's really cute. And the girls especially would play with these corn husk dolls. They didn't have, you know, American Girls or anything like that. So these were their source of fun. And if you can, come over, take a peek at some of these really elaborate corn husk dolls that would have been made. There we go. Okay, now something else that kids could do, you know, as they were sitting watching the fire or whatnot, they could play with a whirligig. This is another type of a game. You'll notice that I have some jute, and that is made out of a dried weed that you would find outside. And you would spin it, make it into a string, and put an old button on it. And you could, I hope I can do this right. You do this, and then you start pulling. And this is left to right, side by side yo-yo. You know, usually the yo-yos that we have in today's time go up and down, up and down, up and down. This button will go back and forth and back and forth. And actually, it is not the easiest thing to do. As you can see. Man, I had this thing spinning last night when I was practicing. So, anyway, we'll just give it a shot. There it goes. And you can just feel it. And you can almost hear it. This is called a whirligig. Now, unless you went outside and found some pretty spectacular stones, there wasn't a whole bunch of jewelry going on back then. So when trees were cut down or saplings, you could get maybe your brother or your dad to cut a little piece of wood, put a string on it. You could even put your name on it in case you forgot who you were. But anyway, you could wear those, and that would be a special thing. You could decorate it with little stones that you might find outside. Okay. Now, let's come across to this side of the house. Take a look at this window. Why do you suppose they'd have such a small window in a log house? Well, it's probably opened, and it probably would need some attention every once in a while simply because people are going to be looking out it. And if you look at the glass in it, okay, it's not nice glass like we have today. It has little rivets in it, and it's kind of wavy. And what they used this window for was to protect themselves. So if there were Indians attacking, and oh yes, there would have been Indians living back in Beaver in this time, they would have to protect themselves because the Delaware Indians, they lived down over the bank, but down by the river in a place called Sawkunk. They would come up and they would actually charge against some of the settlers, the early settlers. They didn't want them here. They did not want them taking their hides, all of the things that they have in terms of animal furs. So they would take their muskets, and they were muskets, and they would put them out the window, and they would be able to shoot attackers. Now, sometimes I wonder what would they have done if they came from the opposite direction. I don't have an answer to that, but at least they would have one place where they could keep themselves safe. Okay, now looking down here, you see different types of animal furs, and they would have bear. Basically, they would have rabbit, and they would have squirrel, and I'm going to show you one that's really kind of cool. I know that it's a fashion statement. This was from a squirrel. Look, Papa, the tail. How would you like to have a tail of a squirrel on top of your head? And they would put this on. Stunning, huh? Anyway, it would keep them warm whenever they would be outside playing. Now, this one probably looks familiar to you. Pepe Le Pew, Mr. Skunk. Okay, but they would use him. And here's a fox. Now this one, they tied or sewed together so that it would be double. And you could actually put an arm up in it. It could be the sleeve of your jacket. Here is a red fox that you see, and they're beautiful, just beautiful. This one also was sewed together and could be used as a sleeve. Ways to keep warm using Mother Nature. And really, when you think about it, okay, we really don't have anything without Mother Nature. Mother Nature has all of the elements in the ground that we use to make our telephones and our electric wiring and our jewelry. All kinds of things were used and learned how to use, to be used right here when you went outside and went exploring. So it's kind of fun to think about that. Next time you think maybe you're not treating Mother Nature as well as you should, you might give it a second thought, because without her, the whole world would be sick and we'd not have anything like a log house. Okay, the furniture here is all authentic. There was a lot of time put into going out and finding these things. I just really can't say enough in terms of the time period and how they used all of the things, the resources that they have. Look at this bird feather. And that was their pen until they learned how to make ballpoint pens, I guess. Very good. This house that we're in, this log house, was found down by the Beaver swimming pool. You all know where that is. And it was covered with a red clapboard exterior. And when they went to knock it down, people in Beaver thought that it was a nuisance. The guy went to knock it down, started pulling off the outside clapboard covering, and found the log house underneath. And what they did was they numbered every single log so that they would know where to put it. And the Amish people then came in and got all of the logs and put it together much like a puzzle. Now, if you take a look at the floor, one last thing I want to talk with you about. Many log houses, and log cabins particularly, they would have had a dirt floor. So whoever lived in this back in 1802 was probably a little wealthier, and they were able to have a wooden floor underneath their feet. That's really a pretty good thing. One last thing that I'd like to talk with you about is the sleeping arrangements. And you've been in a hammock before, I'm sure, and usually there are 2 poles on each side, and then there is a webbing or a netting that kind of is attached to those. They were called, back in the day of 1802, they were called pole beds. And you would have 5, 6, 7 pole beds all pushed aside over into corners so that then the space would be open for living during the day. Now, the kids would sleep upstairs, and there is a little bit of a cut line that you can see here, and that raises up. And they would use a ladder, and the kids would climb up the ladder, and they would sleep on the 2nd floor. Now, they would hustle and huddle across to where the chimney goes up, and they would all kind of gather around that chimney and stay warm. But whoever was sleeping downstairs, the adult, he would have to bank the fire, which means that you kind of push it all in together so it's not going to go out, and that would continue burning through the night for the kids to be able to sleep and stay warm.